Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to the Morna Ravat Show here on Hilaal TV. So, the last time I was on the airwaves engaging with you, the viewers of Hilaal TV, it was the Hajj broadcast. And we were together a number of evenings consecutively talking Hajj, talking Udhiyah, talking Qurbani. And yeah, Hajj has come and gone. The Udhiyah, Qurbani sacrifice has come and gone. The days of Tashriq, of the reciting of the takbir, that has come and gone as well. But the month of Dhul Hijjah is still here, a sacred month. Three sacred months that are consecutive in the Islamic calendar: Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, and Muharram. The Islamic year 1443 is drawing to a close. The Islamic year 1444 will soon commence. Sacred month, continue with the exertions, continue with the efforts, and let's ensure that we minimize the wrongdoing. We gain some spiritual momentum, hopefully, because of the 10 best days of the year, the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. Let's maintain that now. Let's sustain that. Let's try and end the Islamic year on a high and then commence the next Islamic year on a spiritual high, inshallah. We've done quite a bit of religious discussion in the last couple of programs because of Hajj and Udhiyah and Qurbani and all of that. Today we changed the focus a little bit to something very important, and that is the current political climate, the current political state of our country. There's so much to discuss. Almost every one of these topics that we are going to touch on in tonight's program would warrant a separate program on its own. But we're kind of doing an overview. And every now and again we do that. Some of the main issues, just trying to get things a bit clearer, put things into perspective, try and understand things a little bit better. Because we have to take an interest in what happens in our country. This is where we live. This is where we exist. Our prosperity and success is in many ways hinged to what's happening in the country. So our guest is Angelo Fick. He is the head of programs at ASRI. He joins us on the program for us to do a bit of a political overview in terms of the main issues currently facing us here in South Africa. Angelo, a very good evening to you. Welcome.
Good evening to you and to your listeners. Assalamu alaikum.
If I may just start on a note of asking you if there's one word that comes to your mind, because I know you're an avid reader and you've got a good grasp of the language. If you think of the political situation in South Africa currently, and if you were to describe it in one word, what would it be?
Uncertain. I think uncertainty is the status that we all live with and that we have to situate ourselves in. So that would be uncertainty.
Let's start with our number one citizen, the president. I've seen all sorts of titles of late: the silent president, the absent president. Someone referred to him in the media as Mr. Duck and Dive, not speaking much, not saying much. It seems like the days of the family meetings where he was the darling of the nation, engaging, taking people into his confidence, showing leadership, communicating. That's almost a distant memory. Cyril Ramaphosa, I suppose, wears two caps simultaneously. Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of the Republic, and Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of the ruling party, the African National Congress. Let's start with Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa. Where is he at? What are the challenges facing him currently? Where has he fallen short? What does he need to do?
Well, his is an administration that is caught in the center of that uncertainty that I was speaking of earlier. They are many years into their so-called new dawn. It's probably more like middle of the day, shortly after lunchtime in their administration. They have just over 2 years left before the next general elections. And they've now had, 2.5 to 3 years of undoing some of the legacy that they said they wanted to rise above of the Zuma administration. And also people have gotten to know them in the last 2.5 years for their not only just achievements, but failures and spectacular problems. And so as president of the Republic of South Africa, he has to negotiate and navigate the ship of state through this economic crisis, through the ongoing global health crisis, which hasn't ended. In fact, it's complicated by new diseases emerging. And he also has to think very carefully about the political stability of the country, given the outcomes of the State Capture Commission, given the need to do electoral reform ahead of 2024. and possibly other forms of institutional reform of Chapter 9 organizations. And so this is a difficult presidency, as always it was going to be after the Jacob Zuma years, precisely because so much has to be undone, rebuilt, and then new challenges arose that have to also be dealt with.
Why isn't he communicating? I can think back to February 2018, that State of the Nation address that he delivered. It was like a breath of fresh air. Tuma Mina became the buzzword. People were just so happy that here was a person who could communicate much more effectively than his predecessor. His ratings were high at the beginning of COVID, these family meetings. He came across as reassuring, confident, like a man who knew what was happening and had some sort of a plan. Is it fatigue? Is it that he's too occupied with the internal factional issues of the ruling party, which we will talk about a little later? What in your opinion, has made him so hesitant to communicate?
Well, firstly, I'm not one of those people who found the regular communications from Cyril Ramaphosa in the previous sort of era, particularly, shall we say, reassuring. I found them to be really kind of public relations exercises, and they didn't really do what I thought they could do. And that's partly also because so much of what he then said was during a period that people experienced as major crises, and therefore he wasn't as challenged on some of his statements, some of his administration's underperformance, as he could be now. I think one of the reasons to withdraw from public engagement of the kind that we now see is that the international engagements have come up again. So he's had to leave the country, or he's chosen to leave the country to attend a summit in Europe. There are regional issues that have arisen. And then there is, of course, the personal attachment scandals that have come up. And I suppose if you're in the president's communication team, you would be hesitant about putting him out in a public space to address the media or the public gallery on issues that he could, in fact, be seen as distraction from those. We're in the middle of an energy crisis, so one assumes that somebody from cabinet will be addressing the country on issues of the ongoing energy insecurity, the load shedding, the price of the fuel that has been rising so spectacularly, and the consequent cost of living crisis. Whether this is Mr. Ramaphosa or one of those he deputizes remains to be seen. And then I suspect they're also keeping him out of the public space, or he chooses to be out of the public space in that way, because of the deliberation around the state capture report. And so there are many, many things that are coming up that I think we should be kind of preparing ourselves for, and that I think journalists should start making a tally of the kinds of issues that they want to hold the president to account, and that members of parliament should certainly start exercising their oversight role on the executive, which was a bit in abeyance during the COVID crisis, and start holding ministers and calling ministers to parliament to account for several of the issues that have arisen, not least the insecurity, the cost of living crisis, the ongoing health issue, corruption matters, and not wait only for the president's October response to the state capture report.
Is it also perhaps a case of not having anything new to say, really? If you take ESCOM as a case in point, it's been dragging on for so long that one gets the impression that if he has to come and address the nation, it's almost automatic he's going to be accused of regurgitating platitudes, of saying the same things, whereas it perhaps may not be realistic to expect him to say something too much different.
Well, something different does need to be said. And so his account on social media recently indicated that in the next 2 weeks, which presumably was the week past and the week ahead, various organs of the party that he heads will be seized with the question of the energy crisis. But one would want to know what the cabinet cluster responsible for this is doing. One would also want to go back to those performance agreements that the president said he signed with various members of his cabinet when he appointed them 2.5 years ago, and ask whether any of those have been met, and those that haven't been met, whether those particular members of his cabinet live up to this. Now, there's one way in which the public and journalists can address that. They can write to Parliament and ask for these to be questions included to the president. But the parliamentary caucus also has to begin to think of holding the president and the executive to account. and not just in the spectacular state of the nation aftermath and budget questioning, but summon ministers to Parliament to ask them very crucial questions during this time of crisis. They're, after all, the people's elected representatives, and they should, represent the people's concerns. And if there's a cost of living crisis globally, its face in South Africa is infinitely worse because we're the most unequal society in the world. All sorts of economic woes we had ahead of the COVID crisis have been worsened by the COVID crisis. And so there are some questions that, yes, the president has to answer and the people he appointed has to answer, and they have to be answered outside of media briefings, and they have to be responded to through the parliamentary process.
On the aspect of his image, if you were to look at what it was like, rightly or wrongly, proportionately or disproportionately back in 2018 or even in early 2020 and what it is now, where has it gone wrong for him? Why is he no longer the darling of the media and the nation?
So I think part of Mr. Ramaphosa's trouble has been that he came in promising this new dawn. And then the COVID crisis hit in 2020, and several of the people inside his circle, several of his trusted officials, several people he appointed to cabinet, and several of his supporters inside the party were then embroiled in, corruption issues, maladministration issues that very much echoed and mirrored for many people what they said they were rising above, which is the quagmire of the Zuma era. What we're also seeing is that so much of the economic miracle that was being promised couldn't be delivered because partly of global changes consequent to the COVID crisis, but also partly because of internal problems. So the energy crisis was not something that suddenly visited itself on South Africans in 2022. We have known about this since the late 90s. We have experienced it throughout the 2000s. And one would have thought that given the centrality of energy and given the problems at the state-owned enterprises, one of the priorities of the man who, when he was deputy president, was government and business relations and SOEs, would have been to overturn and turn around some of these, including Eskom. Now, we've had other SOEs that took up far more public airtime in this period. Think of, for example, the multiple times we've had to listen to stuff around the South African Airways. But South African Airways, as interesting and important as it may be to the South African economy and to the jobs of the people who work in the aviation industry, isn't as central as the energy provider that is Eskom. And the unbundling of Eskom, the need to provide independent service providers in the power sector to source other forms of generating energy isn't just about making sure that Eskom's failures do not become the country's failures, but they also have to do with the climate catastrophe. South Africa is listed fairly high up, given its industrial output comparatively to other countries, as a major polluter and carbon emitter in the world. In fact, it may be in the top 20, and that's partly, crucially, because of Eskom. And so when you appoint an energy minister like Gwede Mantashe, who insists on this kind of strange policy of ignoring that the second half of the century, into which the majority of young people in this country will live, will be horribly difficult to live in if we maintain an energy policy that says we must replicate the 18th century European industrial revolution with coal and other fossil fuels, that I think speaks to the disconnect between Mr. Ramaphosa's presidency, which retained all of those old men and women from the 20th century to govern a country where the majority of people were born in the 21st.
All right, time now for a quick break. When we come back, we continue the discussion with Angelo Fick. Welcome back. So after all the Hajj-related discussions during the Hajj coverage of the last couple of weeks, we are now doing an overview of the political situation in the country with Asri's Angelo Fick. And in the first segment of the program, we were focusing on Cyril Ramaphosa in his capacity as president of the country. Angelo, the Phala Phala saga, I mean, where would it fit better, a president of the republic or president of the party? Either way, let's take that up. The criticism, again, linked to what we were saying before the break, that he's not communicating adequately, in that he's not answering the questions that need answering, and that if he could just come out and give straightforward, simple answers, it would help to quell what seems to be an issue that now is growing in momentum.
Absolutely, and as you pointed out to your viewers, the shift from the spiritual to the material that your program is taking is one that, of course, influences the way in which we read Mr. Ramaphosa's response. It's not just his material response, but what it reveals about the ethics behind that response. So as president of the country, presumably he was outside of the country when all of this happened. The question is, the people that he appointed to handle this didn't seem to have handled it terribly well. And part of this comes up in the Zondo report into state capture. And there, the reappointment under Mr. Ramaphosa of Arthur Fraser is questioned by the commission. What the wisdom of that was, given Mr. Fraser's particular relationship to the issue of legality and what unlawful conduct he was accused of. Prior to any of this pala stuff. And then, of course, the inability of the President of the Republic of South Africa to immediately provide what in cynical circles would be called plausible deniability, by having the paperwork delivered, by showing this is what was done. An immediate case was lodged at the local police station. When the issues around the Namibian government and the Namibian chief prosecutor's request for information came up, the immediate ability to provide a record that this was in fact the case of the response. It took quite a few days for Minister Lamola to respond and indicate that they had no such record of such a request, which of course, is a different issue. But the inability to provide immediate clarification is, I think, of concern. As a member of the African National Congress, the question would be, to what extent is Mr. Ramaphosa being set up in the way that we know people have accused from inside the ANC, people using the state to sort of sort out party business. Now, we know that these allegations are long-standing in the ANC, where they suggest that the incumbent is using state processes to keep his opponents out of power in the ANC. But is this a case in which those who oppose Mr. Ramaphosa are also using state mechanisms? Because the question is, why Mr. Fraser? Why the Rosebank police station? Why 2.5 years after the fact? Why was this not resolved much earlier, if one is to behave like a good upstanding citizen and suggest that where criminality occurs, you immediately report it? Where are the people who were present in that scene when that happened, and why weren't they reporting this? And the people inside the presidency at the time of the event in 2020 must also account for why they took the route that they did, why this wasn't revealed publicly at the time. And they didn't need to go into details to compromise the head of state or Mr. Ramaphosa's personal security, but they certainly should have been far more transparent, and we shouldn't be sitting 24 months later wondering what happened and why we're getting to learn about this now.
If we think back to the Zuma years, some of the scandals that come to mind, the Waterkloof story, the Gupta plane landing there, in Kandla and the upgrades, are there similarities? Things kind of come to the fore, but you don't get the full story up front, and a similar kind of let the processes take its course response from the accused, being the president at the time. That no, let the processes within the ruling party and the processes within government all unfold, and then you'll get your answer at the end of the day. I'm not willing to come up front and be clean and give and give answers that actually make sense and then answer the very specific questions.
Absolutely. And I don't think we should take partial blame, but there certainly should be introspection on the parts of Fourth Estate watchdogs who were far keener after 2012 and particularly ahead of 2014 to look at Mr. Zuma's administration and particularly the presidency under Mr. Zuma and its actions. And what's interesting is that a similar kind of gaze is not exercised on Mr. Ramaphosa's administration. And so one wants to know why journalists waited until Mr. Fraser walked into a space to find out that the president's personal home had been burgled. Why was this not? What are these journalist sources? And this is not to blame the journalists, but it says something about the trust placed in Mr. Ramaphosa in the first 2.5 years of his presidency that didn't learn the lessons of that you have to watch the head of state much more carefully, and you have to open him up to scrutiny, not in order to take him down, but to ensure that he behaves transparently and that he earns the people's trust. And so, what we've seen is this example in South Africa is not exceptional in the world. We've had similar kinds of issues in the United Kingdom, where the media class's relationship with Boris Johnson has been one of basically kind of overlooking and not asking the probing questions and not keeping their eye and probing the prime ministerial, or in this case, the presidential conduct as well as they could have. And there are lessons to be learned there, not blame to be taken, but certainly whoever comes after 2024, we should certainly keep our eye on the head of state and the management of their offices far more, shall we say, keenly, because we risk this sort of process becoming worse, because there's this endless trust on the next great man will solve the problem and he'll be more heroic than the previous man. We have no guarantee of this. What we do have to have are systems that work and systems that we value, and a media that holds the president to account and holds the president's office to account and monitors it far more carefully than we've seen in the last 4 years in this country. That's an issue that I think is going to become crucial.
Moving on now to Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of the ANC. We know the National General Council was delayed as a result of COVID. There's now a policy conference that's due or overdue, and it's literally, 5 months before we move into an elective conference. Many would be thinking back to 2017 and some of what went on at the time. I don't think we would be too surprised if there's going to be revelations now spread across front pages about people's personal lives, skeletons tumbling out of the closet, big ones or smaller ones. What's your assessment of where the ANC is at currently as a party? Ramaphosa as the leader. Before Phala Phala, there seemed to have been a strong suggestion that in terms of the top job, he's got it in the bag. It's about the remaining 5 and what the mixture will be there. Is it still the same, or are questions now starting to be asked if Phala Phala has come to the fore as a result of Arthur Frazier? What do his political opponents within the party have on him that could come to the fore in the next few months? How do you see things unfolding?
I think that the issue of the way in which the African National Congress deals with and what benefits it can derive from its position in government is going to be crucial. Because the party is certainly aware that 2024 looms large. And so the local government elections of 2021 will have certainly woken up some people, but by 2024, they may be out of power in far more significant spaces than municipalities. But losing the economic heartland of the country is really significant, losing those metros. And so what we've even seen in the Gauteng provincial congresses is that there is concern around losing Gauteng as a province in 2024. So Mr. Ramaphosa and the entire ANC meeting for their policy have to focus on, among other things, economic recovery, employment as an issue, addressing the concerns of the youth, and that's both in the short term by way of employment, improving education and life chances, but also in the longer term when it comes to the climate catastrophe, regional insecurity, etc. My fear is that what's likely to also happen is that there'll be a rise in the kind of rightward swing that we've seen in other parts of the world in global politics, and scapegoats will be, shall we say, invented. And so my concern is that this will become partly the foreign nationals, as the term is used in South Africa, will become the scapegoats for some of the problems created by the ANC and by malgovernance and by South Africa's internal dynamics rather than by foreigners. And the question would be, so if you solve the foreigner problem, who will be the next vulnerable group that we project that onto? Will it just be the rural poor, the urban poor, those who live on the peripheries? Will it be other vulnerable people who will become the scapegoats for our inability to deal with our issues? The other concern that I think the ANC NEC will have to have is making sure that the internal structures of the party are kind of as uncorrupt as they can manage them for 2022's electoral conference. And that means sorting things out at the branch level, not having processes dragged into court endlessly that could affect the delivery of the 2022 electoral conference. And that, I think, is going to be a major struggling point between opposing forces inside the African National Congress who wish to wrestle control of the party back from Cyril Ramaphosa and his group, and possibly towards some other group that may or may not be identified with the previous administration under Jacob Zuma. But it's hard work, not just for the president, for the ANC, because whatever the outcome of 2022's electoral conference is for the party, The public in South Africa, the voting public, will certainly be looking to that, as well as the ANC's record in the last 2.5 years and ahead of 2024. And that's not a particularly good record for the party to try and sell, as people sit through blackouts, power outages, unemployment, corruption at local government level, the health sector in crisis, education in crisis. It's a bleak picture, and the party has to look very carefully for how it's going to try, not just to retain its existing support base, but somehow get people who have never voted for it to vote for it. And that's a tough call, particularly if you have ministerial outbursts that alienate younger people from the party and its vision of South Africa.
Talking about the RET faction, as it's called these days, what's your understanding in terms of who's within the hierarchy, or at least who's at the helm of this faction? On the one hand, the name Jacob Zuma would come to the fore, but he's been out of political office for some time now. Ace Magashule, but he's been suspended for some time. And the understanding is that he's lost his base, or a significant portion of it, within the Free State. You may have a group of disgruntled individuals, and in the mix, a few ambitious individuals who haven't found a home closer to the Ramaphosa camp. Are they structured enough? Is there enough synergy between the different individuals? Is there adequate coordination for them to put up a decent fight come the elective conference in December?
Well, I think this all depends on what happens at the branch level, what happens at the regional level, and what happens at the provincial congresses. So we've already seen those conflicts between people who used to be or are identified with the older administration under Jacob Zuma, people who aligned themselves with the so-called Premier League, which had been disbanded, or disbanded itself as one of the Premier League premiers left and became the deputy president of the Republic of South Africa. And so there are all sorts of rearticulations and reorientations going on. Whether or not those people are able to bring together a sufficient number of delegates by the time of the December 2022 conference remains to be seen. The incumbents, of course, will have the advantage of being able to use the deployee system that the president of the party and the president of the country defended at the Zondo Commission, to ensure that there is some kind of patronage network for people to benefit. But the problem with that is that as they've lost municipal control in several of the key municipalities of Gauteng and elsewhere in the country, they've lost the ability to do that. And so I think with Zandile Gumede in eThekwini, and with the favorable to Mr. Lesufi outcome of the Ekurhuleni conference, we're likely to see a much tougher battle, not just at the policy conference around policy positions that should or shouldn't be adopted and the phrasing of some of those positions, but the battle for which delegates from the branches go to the elective conference will continue long after the regional and provincial conferences are finished, and possibly between the policy and the elective conference, all sorts of rearticulations will happen. And so the problem we saw in the Gauteng provincial conference around the accreditation of delegates is likely to become a major issue at both the policy and the later conference. And so whether Ace Magashule comes in from the cold, whether Zandile Gumede is able to stand for election despite the many, many charges against her and the step-aside rule, whether there is a change in the top 6 or even the remaining 5 outside of the presidency, and one can't imagine the deputy presidency shifting either, so it's really 4. The question is whether the secretariat shifts, and if so, in which direction, and where somebody like, Lindiwe Sisulu puts her support, and not discounting the former Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, who may want to come in from the cold. So there are all sorts of people who've been excluded over the last 2.5 years who remain inside the party, inside the NEC, and may wish to reshift their position to higher up on the list, and so may be courting people at branch level so that delegates and deals are made with delegates ahead of that conference to ensure a different kind of election from the one that people assume is likely to come up.
Where do you see Paul Mashatile fitting in here? He seems to be some sort of a dark horse. A big advantage he has is that he currently has control of the Secretary General's office, with Ace Magashule being suspended and Jesse Duarte not being well. Is he a strong contender now for deputy president? Could he actually challenge Ramaphosa?
If he's challenging for the deputy presidency, one assumes that David Mabuza might have 5 or 10 words to say about that. And so there are all sorts of very strange developments. Also, the Gauteng ANC had traditionally signaled itself as separate from, different from the rest of the country in terms of corruption, in terms of, particularly under the Zuma administration of the party. And that's not necessarily come out as well. This is, after all, the province in which the Life Esidimeni tragedy happened. It's also the province in which the Health MEC ended up embroiled in corruption scandals around PPE provision at the start of the pandemic. Panyaza Lesufi himself, as MEC for Education in the province, was embroiled in a whole thing about cleaning up of schools during the very first days of the pandemic and lockdown. So there are all sorts of issues that have to be resolved. But this is also the party in the Gauteng region that lost control of the Johannesburg City Metro Council, which is the economic heartland of the country. It lost control of the capital of the Republic of South Africa, Tshwane. And so it doesn't come into the national party spaces as this victorious grouping. It has much to account for that it will be held accountable to. And losing Gauteng as a province in 2024, which is a real risk, the party articulated, David Makura said as much at the provincial conference, is something that, again, would be a blow to the ANC, because with that loss would be the loss of the ability to construct patronage networks through the cadre deployment system. And that would be a blow to any party, but to the ANC, which has had financial problems for the last 5 or so years, that would be a particular blow, because membership fees are not as good as they could be in economic crisis times. And major funders may be pulling away from the party because they may be seeing their fortunes in other spaces. What those spaces are remains to be seen, given what we've just learned over the last few months from the My Vote Counts people and what they've unearthed about political party funding in South Africa.
You've used the term patronage networks a few times, and from there flows my next question. Is it realistic to expect that the ANC can be reformed by Ramaphosa or by anybody for that matter? An elective conference is fought in a particular way. We saw what happened in 2017. All the allegations about the amount of money spent by both camps, where that money came from, the kind of deals that needed to be cut, the horse trading that took place. If you look at some of the ministers and their behavior currently, the understanding is that the president can't act because these were the people who supported him in his quest to become the leader, and he's now in many ways indebted to them, and all these constituencies are what keep him aloft on his presidential throne. Is it realistic to expect that it's going to be any different this time around? Maybe different proportions, different characters, but same kind of concepts, same kind of approach, meaning that the ANC doesn't emerge all that different from its 2022 elective conference as compared to 2017. Compromises, backdoor deals, backroom deals, compromised individuals, and a mixed bag within the leadership, making it difficult for the leader or the president to act decisively over the next 5 years?
Well, I'm not optimistic that there is a U-turn possible, given the speed at which this has been happening over the last 2 decades. The role of money in politics in the African National Congress is going to be very difficult to undo. And if you want an example of just how that compares, money plays an important role in any party's political agenda and workings. But the ANC used to be able to rely very strongly on its alliance partners. But under its watch in government, some of the work that those alliance partners are crucially implicated in have been declawed. Think of the weakening of trade unions in South Africa in the last 25 to 30 years. And so the COSATU declawing has been real. Workers' rights have been fought for in very specific ways, but have been clawed back in all sorts of other ways. It's under the ANC's watch, for example, that we saw the finance minister in the late 1990s allow 2 of the biggest local corporate taxpayers decamp to the London Stock Exchange and delist. They were able to return under that same individual's role, who then took on a position as a director in one of those companies. But that revolving door between government and big business is not a South African example. It is a global phenomenon. In Spain, for example, it is decried by members of the opposition. In South Africa, it hasn't yet been decried. Think of the ways in which former finance ministers are now in big business, and think of the ways in which big business have access to government officials. It's not quite as bad as the United States, but it certainly is something that we do need to think very carefully about. For a society that is the most unequal on the planet, where almost a third of the population requires some kind of state support to survive, the president is a billionaire. That says something about the party that says it's pro-poor, but has as its head a billionaire. And then think of the declawing of the South African Communist Party that election after election says they will stand alone on ballots because they disagree with the ANC's policies and implementations, and yet election after election fail to do so. And so, the party that is in power continues to say it's the party of the left, but it's curious that many of its actions are not left actions at all. And so it's hard to see how a party that is this far down the road of having money and capitalist ventures that used to be excused as the ANC as a broad church, how that now has become the dominant, how that reverses itself into a different kind of party, because that is the party that's given us the Eskom crisis, the SAA crisis, the Transnet crisis, the PRASA crisis, all of our public services, the fact that people in Cape Town can't take railway trains reliably to work, that the railway network for passengers across much of the country is gone, the Transnet is where it is, the energy crisis. These are under ANC watch. And you would think a party that speaks socialism would have taken better care of these public assets. The education crisis, the fact that our university students year on year have to wonder how they're going to afford to do this. The food crisis in our schools, the fact that a Minister of Education, a Department of Education can suggest that students who do not go to school should get food at home, and the reason that they have to feed kids in the schools is because those kids can't get food at home, and blame the crisis and the closing down of schools during COVID for that, when measures had to be put in place to make sure that kids who would have gotten that food parcel in school could get it in their communities. The workings of government ministers with one another in the cabinet, one wonders whether these people speak to one another. And so there is a real crisis, and my sense is that the ANC is too far down the road to make a positive U-turn in the way that it keeps saying it wants to.
All right, let's take another break. When we come back, we move into the final segment of the discussion with Angelo Fick. Welcome back. So we're doing a political overview of the situation in the country with ASRI's Angelo Fick. We've spoken at length about President Ramaphosa and his performance as President of the Republic and the associated issues that went with that. We've also spoken in the last segment about his performance as the leader of the ANC, the performance of the ANC itself, the upcoming policy conference, the national elective conference due in December, and the associated discussion points around that. Now, we talk a little bit still about state capture, the other political parties, and one or two other issues before we wrap up. So, Angelo, how do you see state capture fitting into the battle for the leadership of the ANC in the coming months? That's the first part to the question. And the second part, South Africans are skeptical. They'll say, well, we spent R1 billion. It took just a little less than 5 years. Are we actually going to see people in orange overalls genuinely paying for the wrongs that they committed?
Absolutely, and that skepticism is also, buoyed up by hope, and the hope that we can recoup some of that money, and that the recouping of that money is not going to result in further corruption by the people who then get that money. And then the second issue is, I think, that there is a real crisis for people inside the African National Congress who are true believers. People who believe that they have spent their entire lives inside this organization struggling for human rights, struggling for a better society and a better way of living for not just themselves. And those are not necessarily the people who live in the suburbs. They're the people who go to branch meetings not cynically, not for their own individual gain, but because they're believers in social justice and in the agenda that they've identified with this organization for many, many years. And those people have a great crisis ahead of them because they presumably have a stake in sort of wresting the party away from its crisis, and what they would see as its demise. And at the same time, being honest with themselves that to what extent can this continue. And that's real. So the ANC has both its internal crisis and a sort of great task ahead of it to try to convince South Africans who are looking to its record to say, why this time should we trust you, given that we've trusted you over and over and you haven't delivered?
In the middle of all of this, you've got the hearings against the public protector that is now underway in Parliament. The aggressive Dali Mpofu making headlines, the deputy or the acting public protector now making moves, which is interpreted differently by different people, depending where you sit in the political spectrum. How important is this? How much of attention should this be given?
I think it is an important process. I don't think it should be reduced to a soap opera of personalities and characters. I think there are principles at work here. And it's the principle of whether a department should use taxpayers' money to pursue the quixotic legal processes of an incumbent who has been suspended. And we've seen constitutional court judgments on this for ministerial conduct. Where ministers fighting challenges to their maladministration or misconduct, and one thinks here back to Batabile Dlamini when she was in control of the Social Development Department and the SASSA crisis. Really, it shouldn't be a case where people can continue to use taxpayers' money to fund their own quixotic and often, pie-in-the-sky approaches to legal challenges. That there should be a limit to how much and for how long any public official can use public money to pursue what they see as an individual justice point. The second issue is, of course, the process in Parliament is absolutely essential because it speaks to the accountability relationship between Chapter 9 institutions and the people's elected representatives. And yes, of course, there are political battles being fought. But beyond those political battles are the constitutional principles that separate powers and structure accountability in particular ways. And that kind of process should be valued and should be applied across all of them. We've seen what happens when people hijack, for example, the Judicial Services Commission for their own political games. This is utterly unacceptable because taxpayers are paying for it. That's all of us when we buy bubblegum, when we buy bread. This really has to end, that South Africans should be served by their institutions, not politicians and people with political scores to settle use those institutions to serve themselves and their egos.
We spoke at length about the ANC, and understandably so. How are the other parties doing, the major ones specifically?
Well, they need to do very deep introspection because if their dismal performances in the 2021 local government elections are anything to go by, they really should think to themselves how, with a party in government and a majority party across the national landscape, and with the party that was identified as being the face of corruption in local government, as the ANC has been, they continue to perform as poorly as they did. And that, I think, is crucial because the electoral reform processes that are underway are meant to allow more independence into national and provincial legislatures. We've not seen the massive take-up at the municipal level that one would have imagined this would have done. But they need to do some deep introspection and ask why they aren't able to speak to the many, many millions of disaffected people who either choose to stay away from voting or vote in such fractured ways that the top three parties after the ANC aren't able to grow substantially into the 30% and challenge, even at municipal level often, and challenge a party as riven with scandal and as untrustworthy as many South Africans have found the ANC.
Coming down to ground level, I mean, the petrol price is just skyrocketing in a way that is beyond imagination. You've got the Eskom electricity challenges, the higher unemployment on the back of COVID, and the list goes on. We know the story. We've just recently seen what happened in Sri Lanka, where the public just had enough. They stormed the presidential compound. Somebody interestingly said, yes, they went there, they swam in his pool and showered in his shower and jumped on his bed, but they didn't burn or break or cause any damage to the infrastructure. We've seen what's happened in the UK. Boris Johnson eventually having to pay the price for scandal upon scandal, for lie after lie. How similar and how different is it in South Africa? How likely is it that people will take to the streets as a result of frustration, or perhaps because of being instigated, kind of like what we saw last year with the insurrection or the looting? How likely is it that ministers in South Africa could say that we've had enough and we are now resigning en masse to put pressure on the president to step down?
I don't think we'll see a Boris Johnson scenario in South Africa because the African National Congress would not pursue that action in my reading of them and their historical record when it comes to the party's relationship to the president, because that would be seen to do the opposition's work for it. What I think the African National Congress in South Africa and South Africa's political and economic elite need to look to is not necessarily only the spectacle of Sri Lanka, but to go back a decade to Tunisia, where there was also a gap in age and wealth between the governed and the governors. And that resulted in not just the overthrow of the then Tunisian government, but a spiral into political instability that the Tunisian state is still unable to shake. And in South Africa, like in Tunisia, we open ourselves up to people's needs, insecurities, and anxieties being addressed by very opportunistic, rightward-leaning, xenophobic, communitarian politicians who will take us into a kind of South Africa that we will have wanted to leave behind, negotiated our way out of in the 1990s, because we can ill afford a spiral of violence. We're already a society pockmarked by gendered violence, pockmarked by class violence, pockmarked by violations of other kinds related to inequality and poverty, any kind of situation where the state loses control over, among other things, security will make the horrible events of the last 2 weekends and the events a year ago in July really pale in comparison. And that's something that all of us should be invested in avoiding. And that includes private actors, that includes people in civil society organizations, in religious organizations, in families, in schools, in educational institutions, is to pull us back from the situation, not to maintain the status quo, but to prevent us from spiraling into the kind of instability from which it will be impossible to return, as the Tunisian example demonstrates.
I'll conclude, Angelo, with what I started with, and that is focusing on our number one citizen, President Ramaphosa. There are those who say that he should go, and then there are those who argue that all things considered, yes, they are disappointed. Yes, he no longer enjoys the kind of popularity that he used to. He's got some serious questions to answer. There may be some degree of suspicion, but all things considered, he's still the best man for the job, especially if you look at who stands right behind him and who's likely to succeed him. Your thoughts on that as we close?
I think people who say that this is the lesser of many evils must remember that if you choose the lesser evil, you're still choosing evil, and that kind of can build up over decades, that you choose the candidate who's not as bad as the other candidate. We need to avoid that. Secondly, if the president is to be removed, it has to be done via the legitimate parliamentary process. And that, I think, is crucial, because we cannot continue to have party removals of heads of state and heads of government. And that I think, is one of the concerns one should have. If the party removes him, one has to ask the reasons for his removal, and then think very crucially, even though it will be legal, to what extent that will be about ensuring a particular kind of future for the party. Should the party remove him in the way that they removed Thabo Mbeki, I think that's very likely to cause the ANC much longer term damage. Should Parliament remove him, the process will be a lot more complicated, because the internal issues of the party will work itself out in the caucus. And as we've seen in the Boris Johnson example, that leaves the party itself weakened, because riven, and then you'll have infighting of the kind that I think no political party can survive in the longer term. And so the ANC is not just at a crossroads, it's at the end of a cul-de-sac.
Angelo Fick, as always, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. All right, that brings us to the end of the program. Until next week, inshallah, fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.